and they became a lot poorer and less able to challenge him. So again, political considerations proved to be very important. And later on in the course, we'll have several lectures on ethnic politics, political institutions, democratization, and we'll try to understand these patterns. But so even during the good times, investments weren't being made. Now, after that period, economic growth, as we saw before, turns negative and stays negative for about 25 years. Why is that the case? This is one of these questions you should just have in the back of your mind. I put a few questions up. Why is Africa poor? Why did they grow in the 70s, 80s? And throughout the course of the term, we're going to come up with a bunch of different explanations. You should think about which of those you think is most plausible. We'll discuss and debate in class which one has the best evidence. So there's no one answer. There's a lot of debate. One important factor was the global economy went into recession in the 1970s. It wasn't just Africa. There were big recessions in the US, in Europe, in Latin America, some of them around the oil shocks of the 1970s. It also turns out, and we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, it turns out that the 70s and 80s were a period of terrible drought in Africa. So agricultural production collapsed, in part because there were historically awful droughts. On top of that, in the 60s and 70s, when African countries were growing, they accumulated a lot of national debt. So a lot of European and US countries were lending to African countries saying, hey, these guys are growing at, they were growing about 5% a year. So 2.5% per capita growth and then 2.5% population growth. So hey, these African countries are growing 5% a year. Let's lend them money. They'll pay us back as their economies grow. Seems like a good investment. Well, it seemed like a great investment until African growth turned negative, and African country after African country basically defaulted on their debt. So in the meantime, they accumulated this huge debt, which became quite a burden. Okay, so there's a lot of candidate explanations. We're going to talk about more, but these are some of the issues we're going to think about this term. Now, that's the sort of bad set of patterns, the downside. But I mentioned before, even during this dark period, in terms of growth, there were a couple things that stood out as successes in Africa. So one of them is education. If you read the accounts of African political leaders in the 1960s, so most African countries became independent in the early 60s, independent of European imperialists. They become independent in the early 60s. If you read the speeches of new leaders, if you read accounts in the newspapers, the number one priority in country after country after country was education. That was the key focus. Education remains the largest budget item in most African countries. There's been a huge focus on education. Now, at the start in the 1960s, very few people in most African countries were literate. So they started way behind other countries. But they've had rapid increases in education. And I think in the slides I put up last time, you saw that the average years of schooling in some West African countries today, among people 25 and older, was only 1 to 2 years. But among kids in school today, projected years of schooling is often 7, 8, 9, 10 years of schooling. So there's a massive investment in education that's been going on, and that's reflected in literacy rates, that's reflected in primary school enrollment, and also secondary school enrollment. So that's been a success story. Even in the 80s and 90s, education showed some gains. The one downside, though, is even though a lot of kids are now in school, there's a lot of questions about the quality of that schooling. And we'll talk about this when we talk about education. So now the kids are in school, how can we get them to learn more? What can governments and NGOs and others do to actually have them learn more in cases where there are too few teachers, too few textbooks, underfunded schools, etc.? That's a big challenge. How can dollars in education go farther in Africa to improve learning? That's going to be a big question that we're going to come to in a few weeks. Okay, another big success story is infant mortality. Again, even in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, during a period of economic decline, you see big improvements in health, particularly in infant mortality. So infant mortality is mortality of kids under 1, and then child mortality is classified as mortality of kids under 5. Now, I'm only showing this through about 2000 just because I want to make this point that even during slow growth periods, you see some improvement. So what do you see in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s? You see decline. So what are these numbers? This bar right here in the middle, this is the median African country. So again, even in the 80s, mid-70s to 2000, this period of zero growth, there's a pretty substantial decline in infant mortality. Not everywhere. So the whiskers on the top and the bottom show the extreme countries. The worst off countries actually got a little worse in the 80s, 90s to 2000. Some of those are countries like Sierra Leone where there was civil war, and a lot of health measures actually got worse in the 90s. But the best countries got much, much better, and the median country got better. So again, there was improvement in health even without economic growth. But the progress was uneven. The block to the right here is what I just showed you, and then it's broken down by different regions of Africa. You can see West Africa has the worst health measures. West Africa also has the worst education measures. So again, throughout the course, we're going to start breaking down Africa into regions and countries and subregions. So one kind of cut you can start seeing in this data is West Africa tends to be the poorest subregion. Southern Africa tends to be the richest one, and that's shown in lower infant mortality rates. And Central and East Africa are somewhere in the middle. They look more typical of sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. But in all these regions, you see these declines in infant mortality rates. Now, can anybody interpret the vertical axis for me? So that says under 5 mortality per 1,000 births. What was median, and I'll go back to the big figure, what was median under 5 mortality per 1,000 births in Africa in 1960? Over 200. Okay, so almost a quarter of kids died before age 5. That is terrible. Absolutely miserable. What is it by the end of the period? Maybe 150, maybe 140. These mortality rates, I will say, over the last decade have continued to decline. So this number now, this median under 5 mortality in Africa, is now more like 100. So from the 60s till today, in about 50 years, you have a decline of about 50% in child mortality. That's a big improvement. It's still not as good as what you see in Asia. It's way behind the rich countries, but it's a reduction of half in child mortality in a period where African growth was pretty poor. So you actually can improve human outcomes even without economic growth, and this is evidence of that. Okay, yeah. So what's the cause of these reductions? A big part of these reductions, when people have looked at them, and it's not just in Africa, also true in Asia, is there was a lot of targeted foreign aid in health. There were a lot of vaccination campaigns run by the World Health Organization or UNICEF. There were a lot of health investments funded by bilateral donors and others. And there were government health investments in some cases that were also very important. But foreign aid donors played a really critical role. There was a lot of expertise in the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the UN that really went country to country and implemented vaccination programs and trained local staff in these programs. And it really was a lot of those vaccination programs, oral rehydration programs, distribution of antibiotics, et cetera, that led to these improvements in child health. So foreign aid donors played a very important role. I think that's the consensus. And that's part of the reason why there might be this decoupling between economic growth and these health outcomes. So even if the economy is collapsing, as long as the appropriate expertise and funding is made available to local health authorities with some international assistance, they can still achieve these gains. Yeah. So with a lot of the vaccination campaigns, a lot of the complaints is it is very much in and out. Like teams came in with expertise, would hire local staff, and then basically run these vaccination camps that weren't very permanent. Well, temporary gains, although if the WHO does it every year and the kids stop dying, then it wasn't like it went down and then it went back up. So, but you're making a very important point, which is you're not building necessarily the infrastructure for people in the country to sort of take it on themselves. Now, with more recent health efforts, the most high-profile health investment by foreign aid donors over the last decade has been what's called PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, something like that. That's a U.S. government program. Let me just write it down. I'm sure I got the acronym wrong. PEPFAR. This was the kind of signature foreign aid program of the Bush administration, and it has put billions and billions of dollars in funding for antiretroviral treatment against HIV/AIDS. And by all accounts has saved millions of lives, this program. This program subsidizes drugs, but has done more than earlier programs to try to invest in infrastructure. At least that's the claim that's made. So, donors have done different things with different programs, but I think a lot of the gains we're seeing in this figure were donors played a critical role. Even if it was in and out, it still saved a lot of lives. Okay, so that said, and this question sort of comes to it, even though there were gains, some of the health gains we saw were slowed down in the 80s and 90s with the spread of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which just put tremendous strain on health systems. And beyond HIV/AIDS, many African countries are still burdened by lots of different tropical diseases. Malaria being the most prominent, TB, various infectious diseases, cholera. So there's still tremendous health challenges, and in a couple weeks we're going to talk in detail about tropical disease and how the tropical disease burden may affect growth. Okay, so here, and let me just get to the growth numbers. Again, we saw that in the 70s to early 80s, it looked like poverty rates in China, India, and Africa were pretty similar. Maybe in China they were even higher poverty rates, but African incomes fell while these other regions did well. But since 2000, per capita growth has been about 3% a year. So this is even faster than it was in the earlier periods. This is the third sort of episode of African growth, and it's been very widespread growth. So in the 70s, from 1975 to 2000, the majority of African countries had negative growth. It wasn't like a few outliers were pulling down the average. Since 2000, the majority have had positive growth. So the whole region has turned around, including the two largest economies. So by far the two largest economies in Africa, in terms of GDP, are South Africa and Nigeria. They've both had positive growth since about 2000. So again, these big questions I just want you to keep in the back of your mind. Why was performance relatively good in the 60s and 70s? Why did it fall off? And why did it get better? We're going to spend some time this term trying to understand what changed. Was it policy that changed? Was it institutions that changed? Was the growth the result of earlier investments? Did foreign aid donor policy change? Or what happened? We're going to talk about the role of China and Asia more broadly in driving African development. I think a lot of observers think that African economies have benefited from growth in Asia because there's so much demand for things that Africa produces. We'll talk about that next week. So there's a lot of factors. So keep track in your own mind about candidate answers to these questions, because these are the big questions for African economic policy. And this is what the numbers look like. What I'm showing you here in the red line is the average for sub-Saharan Africa. This is per capita income. And then the dashed blue line is Kenya. And I'm just putting Kenya up because it's a country we're going to return to a few times during the term. It's an East African country that is fairly representative for Africa, and you'll see that their growth experience is also similar. So what do we see here? We see the three periods very starkly. There's an early period of growth in the 60s and 70s with about, say, 2% per capita income growth. There's a period of decline from 75 to 2000 with about minus 1% per year growth. And then rapid growth since about 2000 of about 3% per year. So African per capita income today is actually higher than it's ever been. In the 80s and 90s, Africans could look back at the 70s and say, we were doing better 20 years ago than we are today in most cases. No longer. African incomes are higher, and they've continued to grow in 2013 into 2014. So the trend continues. The Kenyan case is similar, a little different. You see the rapid growth in the 60s and 70s. Now, Kenya does not have negative growth in the 80s and 90s. They just have stagnation. Per capita income is just flat. The economy was just growing fast enough to keep up with population, but no faster. But since about 2000, they've had positive growth as well. It turns out if you look at the data, some of the countries that had the most negative growth experiences in the 80s and 90s were countries that had civil wars and civil conflicts, like Sierra Leone, which is the country I mentioned before. In Sierra Leone, during their civil war, which went from 1991 to 2002, per capita income fell 40%. It just fell off a cliff. But of course, it was a brutal war, tons of displacement. The countries without war, like Kenya, basically had stagnation during the 80s and 90s. Any other patterns or trends come through you guys in this figure here? What do you see that's noteworthy here? Yeah. So the big change with structural adjustment programs comes in after about 82, which was true in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, and the kind of high watermark for those policies goes into the 90s, and then starting in the mid-90s to late 90s, you see shifts in bank IMF policies. So this is a period with very particular types of foreign aid policy, and we'll have two readings later in the term we talk about the effects of those policies. The big debate among economists is how much of this slowdown was due to those policies versus how much did the slowdown sort of lead the donors to adopt those policies. Now, they could both be true. It could be that those policies slowed growth, but the initial drop in growth led to a change in policy. It might have just sort of reinforced each other, but we will discuss that later on in the term. That's one of the most politically contentious issues. Now, since the late 90s, donor policies have changed, and you do see an increase in growth. So if you kind of are inclined to interpret bank IMF policies, the structural adjustment policies, as being detrimental to growth, this would be consistent with that worldview. But there's other people that say, no, it's sort of reverse causality. Like, when Africa was defaulting on debt, then the bank and the IMF came in with certain policies. When they started growing again, the bank and the IMF sort of eased off them. And disentangling those has been, for at least 15 years, there's been sort of paper after paper trying to disentangle them. It's a bit hard to. Yeah. You think there was no impact? You don't see any impact of that here? Yeah. Yeah, 97 doesn't seem like it was much of a trend break there. You see a little bit of a blip in 2007-8 with the global recession, but not much. African growth rates have stayed high, even as sort of European rates and others have fallen. You all had your hand up? This is just the figure that we put together, and I just put Kenya up because we're going to come back to it, so it's interesting to see that they have a broadly similar trajectory. I should have put Sierra Leone up here too, because we'll have a few papers on Sierra Leone, which is West African, but the Sierra Leone case, maybe I'll do that for another lecture, kind of looks similar here, it flattens out, and then in the 90s it just plummets, and then it increases again. So the 80s and 90s were bad sort of throughout Africa. Yeah. Yeah, and then they have the Civil War, and then the Civil War ends in 2002. So again, since there were so many civil wars in the 80s and 90s, there's a number of countries where you see this kind of decline in that period. Probably Mozambique would be similar. Yeah, so maybe Angola, we could plot them out too. We have that data. Huge growth. And Sierra Leone has also had really rapid growth. So there was another hand up. the back? Did I see a hand? No. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. In a couple weeks, I'll show you how growth rates link to temperature and rainfall. So there's actually, that'll be a topic we come back to. So because African economies are so dependent on agriculture, and there's very little irrigation, water irrigation in African agriculture, when the rains are bad, per capita income falls in Africa. So year-to-year rainfall variability is really important, as it is in many parts of South Asia. So there are semi-arid parts of South Asia where rainfall shocks matter, but there's a lot more irrigation in India, say, than in Africa. So the irrigation and the large dams and water reservoirs help to shield farmers from those fluctuations. Okay, so again, I mentioned Kenya. We're going to come back to it. It kind of illustrates a lot of the ups and downs. This is a map of Africa showing where Kenya is in East Africa. And I want to just mention it because they've had a lot of instability in recent years, even after 2000. And I just want to highlight the role of politics here. I mentioned before how part of the reason why infrastructure investments were not made very well in the 70s and 80s were political. Well, political instability and political divisions are still a major concern. So Kenya, again, looks kind of like Africa. After about 2000, there's rapid growth in a number of sectors: processed food, processed flour, flour cutting, telecommunications. There was a lot of innovation in the use of mobile phones, new mobile financial products. There was a lot of interesting innovation and growth in new sectors in Kenya and some rapid economic growth. There was a contested election in 2007, which most observers thought was rigged. That set off a couple months of ethnic clashes. A couple 100,000 people were displaced, and economic growth suffered as a result. So even in a country like Kenya that's fairly well off by African standards, has had a lot of development in new sectors, political instability is still a concern. So the economic turnaround in some cases is still politically fragile going forward. We can't necessarily just assume that that nice upward trend we saw over the last decade would continue. Everybody wants it to continue. We want poverty rates to fall. We want there to be improved living standards in Africa, but there's still a lot of challenges. Now, one good sign, though, is there were elections last year, the sort of next national elections after the violence of 2007, 2008, and those were fairly peaceful, and there was no ethnic clashes, peaceful transfer of power. So again, it's ambiguous. Some elections lead to instability, some don't. And I think I'm out of time. So let's meet on Tuesday. Please try to register your iClickers by then, and I'll start putting up some iClicker questions.